I flew into the United States on the 17th of May. I'd flown around the world as I had 2 years ago before I talked at Mind States. I went to Hungary for a couple of days for a conference. And so I get to America and I'm in that state that you've been because I've come 3/4 of the way around the world. And I'm just sort of in a fog for several days. By the time I'm starting to sort of tune in and dealing with my family and everything, and I realized that one of the differences between America and Australia is that everywhere there's cable TV and it's always on. And so of course, what do? Well, I watch the news. And soon, all of a sudden through the news, you start filtering up reports about a young man named Andrew Speaker. There's a picture of him. Mr. Speaker had just gotten married. He just had a honeymoon in Greece. And it was interesting because he went to Greece because he got to the airport in Atlanta, got on a plane and flew, I think, to Italy and then over to Greece and stayed for a couple of days. And then he went home again, but he went home by a very circuitous route because he didn't actually just fly back to Atlanta. He flew to Montreal and then drove across the border. Now, why would you do this? Why didn't he go back directly? Well, if you were watching the news, you know the reason he didn't go back directly. He was on a watch list. He wasn't on a watch list because he was a free thinker, or because he was a terrorist, or because he was some other sort of undesirable. No. Mr. Speaker had been diagnosed with a disease. So let's talk about that disease for a minute. It's the most important, the most widespread, and the deadliest disease probably in the history of the world, at least for 3,000 years, because they found it in mummies. And it's not smallpox, it's not the bubonic plague, it's not measles or mumps or malaria or AIDS. What is it? There we go. Tuberculosis, otherwise known to the English in Victorian language as consumption. Now, we never, ever think about TB in the West. When I was getting my permanent residency in Australia, I had to make an appointment with the state agency that checks you out. And I went in and I got a chest x-ray, and the woman who was x-raying my chest was actually from Minnesota, so we had a good little conversation about immigrating. And I'm like, what's the chest x-ray for? She says, oh, we're checking to see if you have TB. And I just sort of laughed and thought, how quaint. And really, I thought, how archaic. Little did I know. 1 in 3 people on planet Earth, 2 billion people, 1/3 of humanity is infected with tuberculosis. That's the baseline. Now, most of those people who are infected will never experience any symptoms because your immune system will hold the TB in check. But it is completely pervasive. It's probably the most infectious disease in the world right now. But TB, like all other opportunistic illnesses, I should say successful illnesses, is highly opportunistic. It'll use whatever it can get its hands on, whether that maybe is warfare, or famine, or maybe an accident, to get a foothold. Because when your body's resources have been marshaled to do something else, like fleeing from guns, or staying alive when there's no rain falling, or recovering after you've broken a leg, that's when TB will gain a foothold. It's when your body's looking the other way. And this is an enormous problem in Africa because TB is especially endemic in Africa, and AIDS, as an opportunistic infection itself, often kills by killing people with TB. Now, until this century, we couldn't treat TB. If you were wealthy enough, they would pack you away to a sanitarium and you would rest, and your body would either win the battle and you'd recover and go on and live your life, Eugene O'Neill being a very, very famous case of that, or you'd die. And that's just the way it was. There was nothing you could do about it. And then, in the early 20th century, along came those unqualified, unbelievably successful wonder drugs, the antibiotics. Antibiotics, by themselves, have done more to extend human lifespan than any other single innovation. What are they? They're complex molecules, and what do? Well, you know, if you have a bacterial infection, such as TB, or several others, lockjaw, all these other different things, they have a surface coating, a cell wall, and the antibiotic gets in there and jams the cell wall. does something to it to make it permeable, makes it very easy for your body to recognize it or to kill it, or just kills it outright. And it makes the bacteria rupture, and then no more bacteria, no more bacterial infection, and all of a sudden you're living to 76 years old, or 78, or 80. Of course, there are a lot of different kinds of bacteria in the world. Many, many more kinds of bacteria than there are anything else, even beetles in the world. And so we have whole families of antibiotics that are targeted to the fact that some bacteria have one kind of coat on them and some bacteria have another kind of coat on them. So you have penicillin, which was the original, most powerful antibiotic, and cyclosporin, and Cipro, which is great if you happen to get anthrax, if you remember that from a few years ago. And there's a few, luckily, that even work against TB. And TB is actually a kind of rare bird here, because TB is very similar genetically to the bacteria that causes Hansen's disease or leprosy. It has a very, very hard coating on it. It's very, very, very thick. You can think of it almost like a jelly bean. It's a very, very hard coating on it and a nice gooey middle. Well, that bacterial coating means that the bacteria have to spend a lot of energy maintaining that coating. They don't divide very quickly. This is why TB doesn't kill you in a week. It takes months or years to kill you, and why leprosy takes even longer than that. Even now, in 2007, with all of the modern clinical techniques, they have never successfully grown Hansen's disease or leprosy in the lab. They can't do it, because it grows too slow and under two weird conditions. It grows fine in a person if you happen to be the right person, but it doesn't grow anywhere else. Of course, this has a big upside for TB, because why would you invest so much energy in making this coat that makes it really hard for you to divide and multiply? Well, it means that you can withstand a lot of crap from the outside, and one of the things that you can withstand is a lot of attack by antibiotics.